The Kronos hegemony, an empire forged in the crucible of countless star systems, stood as a monument to galactic dominance. Its fleets, vast and unyielding, patrolled the known cosmos, their hulls gleaming with the promise of order and the implicit threat of annihilation. For centuries, the hegemony had considered itself the pinnacle of intelligent life, their advanced technology and ironclad martial discipline making them unquestioned masters. Other, lesser civilizations either bent the knee or were swept aside, their histories reduced to footnotes in the grand saga of Kronos expansion. Arrogance was not merely a trait, it was an ingrained philosophy, a birthright of every citizen, a core tenet of their very existence. Commander Valerius Thorn, his obsidian-plated uniform reflecting the sterile glow of his flagship's bridge, regarded the emerald blue orb hanging in the viewport. This was Ethelgard, the latest jewel in the hegemony's crown, a virgin world untouched by any known civilization. His sharp, angular features, typical of his species, betrayed a keen intellect and an even keener ambition. Valerius had spearheaded the scout missions, personally overseeing the initial planetary scans that had returned truly astonishing results. No discernible indigenous sentient life, a rich abundance of exotic biotics, and vast, untapped mineral reserves. A perfect candidate for immediate colonization, a testament to his foresight and the hegemony's divine right to claim all that was theirs. Reports are nominal, Commander, announced Chief Navigator Kalen, his voice crisp and professional. All orbital arrays deployed. Deep scan probes confirm geological stability. Atmosphere Class M, perfectly breathable for Kronos physiology. Initial biodiversity reports exceed all projections. Valerius allowed a flicker of satisfaction to cross his face. Excellent, Navigator. Prepare the ironclad for orbital descent. Dr. Thorn, are your teams ready for ground deployment? From a holographic display shimmering beside him, Dr. Eris Thorn's image flickered into focus. Eris, Valerius's distant cousin and the lead xenobotanist on the expedition, possessed a softer, more contemplative demeanor, though no less dedicated to the hegemony's cause. My teams are eager. Commander, the preliminary atmospheric samples indicate a truly unique ecosystem, flora unlike anything documented in the galactic archives. We've even detected unusual crystalline structures beneath the surface, responding to subtle electromagnetic fluctuations. Eris's voice held a note of genuine scientific excitement. Fascinating, Dr. Valerius replied, his tone polite but dismissive of what he considered academic trivialities. Ensure your initial surveys focus on resource identification. Aesthetic value can be cataloged later. We are here to claim, not merely observe. The Ironclad, a heavy transport modified for initial colonial deployment, plunged through Ethelgard's cerulean atmosphere. Valerius watched from the bridge of his cruiser as the vessel, dwarfed by the vibrant planetary canvas, descended towards the designated landing zone. The view from orbit had been breathtaking vast. Unbroken emerald forests gave way to sapphire oceans, punctuated by mountain ranges that shimmered with unknown minerals. It was a world of unparalleled beauty, a verdant paradise ripe for the taking. The initial ground teams reported back with a mixture of awe and professional assessment. The air was sweet, carrying the scent of exotic blossoms and damp earth. Towering trees, their leaves a kaleidoscope of greens and purples, formed natural canopies, while rivers of crystal-clear water meandered through valleys carved by unseen forces. The fauna, though abundant, appeared docile, retreating into the foliage at the approach of Kronos personnel. Dr. Eris Thorn, clad in a reinforced environmental suit, stepped onto the soil of Ethelgard, feeling the soft give of the verdant ground beneath their boots. Unbelievable, Eris murmured, running a gloved hand over the dew-kissed petals of a luminous flower. The bioluminescence is systemic, not merely superficial. It appears to communicate, or perhaps to react to our presence. Over the comms, Valerius's voice cut through. Doctor, refrain from anthropomorphizing the flora. It is an underexplored ecosystem, nothing more. Focus on establishing the initial biosphere analysis. We expect a full report on viable agricultural zones by end cycle. Despite Valerius's stern directive, Eris found themselves increasingly captivated by Ethelgard's ecological intricacies. The plants seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, to accommodate their presence. Pathways through dense foliage would appear suddenly, leading to pristine water sources or open clearings ideal for temporary encampments. It was as if the very landscape was eager to please, to roll out a welcome mat for its new inhabitants. This unusual responsiveness was logged, of course, but initially dismissed as an unprecedented example of a reactive ecosystem, a testament to Ethelgard's biological vitality. However, the longer the initial teams remained on the surface, the more the subtle anomalies began to accumulate. Ensign Rorik, a junior botanist assigned to Eris's team, was the first to vocalize his unease. Doctor, I'm detecting a resonance within the larger tree structures. It's not sonic, not seismic. It's like a deep, persistent hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. Eris, calibrating their own sensors, frowned. I'm getting faint energy readings, Rorik, but nothing that registers as acoustic. Perhaps it's a localized electromagnetic field interacting with your suit's internal comms. No, Doctor, it feels internal, Rorik insisted, tapping his temple. Like it's coming from inside my head. It's been happening for cycles now. And the dreams, he trailed off, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Dreams, Eris prompted, making a mental note. Stress-induced psychological phenomena were not uncommon during initial colonial deployments. Just odd dreams, Rorik mumbled, shaking his head, of things shifting, changing, like the ground itself is breathing. Eris dismissed it as fatigue, instructing Rorik to report to the medical bay for a neural scan if the feeling persisted. They logged the anomaly as unattributed low-frequency energy signature and recommended further investigation, a recommendation Valerius promptly sidelined as non-critical academic curiosity. Days bled into weeks. The primary colonial hub, New Kronos, began to take shape. Sprawling across a wide, fertile plain, domes rose, prefabricated structures locked into place, and mining operations began to bore into the rich earth. The process was astonishingly smooth. Too smooth, Eris often mused privately. There was no resistance, no unforeseen geological hazards, no hostile weather patterns. Ethelgard was yielding its bounty with an almost eager compliance. Then, Ensign Rorik disappeared. He had been on a routine survey loop, a path he had walked countless times. Deep within a particularly lush forest sector, his bioscanner, still active, suddenly flatlined. Search parties, augmented by aerial drones, scoured the sector for 3 cycles. They found his dropped data slate, its screen still displaying botanical classifications, but no trace of Rorik himself. No blood, no struggle, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle, just an empty space where a Kronos hegemony officer had been moments before. Valerius, his face grim, convened a meeting. "This is a regrettable incident," he announced, his voice reverberating through the command center. "Preliminary analysis points to an indigenous predatory creature. We failed to fully catalog the local fauna, a lamentable oversight." but one we will rectify immediately. Deploy hunting parties. Eliminate any and all threats. Aris, however, felt a cold dread begin to seep into their professional detachment. Commander, the bioscans indicated no large predators in that sector, and the lack of any physical trace. It's deeply concerning. Even the most efficient predator leaves a mark. Perhaps a creature with a highly efficient digestive system, Valerius retorted. His eyes narrowed. Do not let academic pedantry interfere with practical action. Doctor, fear is an indulgence we cannot afford. We have a world to conquer. The hunting parties returned empty-handed, reporting only the same docile creatures they had observed before. Yet, more and more often, Kronos personnel began to report the hum. It wasn't just Rorik's imagination. Sentries on night duty swore they could hear it, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, occasionally accompanied by faint, indistinguishable whispers carried on the wind, or so they thought. Medical officers, under pressure from Valerius to maintain morale, attributed these reports to auditory fatigue and colonial stress syndrome, dispensing sedatives and ordering mandatory rest cycles. Eris, however, began to secretly conduct their own unsanctioned experiments. They isolated the subtle energy signatures Rorik had described, amplifying them in their personal lab. The readings were baffling. They fluctuated, not randomly, but with a rhythmic, almost organic pattern. When Eris ran the amplified signal through a linguistic processing matrix, the results were not static. There was a pattern, a structure, but it defied all known linguistic analysis. It was like hearing a language, but one that shifted and reconfigured itself faster than any system could process. It wasn't just noise, it was active. One evening, as Eris reviewed the latest energy signatures, they noticed something new. The luminous patterns in the native flora around New Kronos seemed to be mirroring the structural integrity readings of the nascent colonial hub. A support beam would develop a microfracture, and a cluster of bioluminescent flowers nearby would subtly alter their glow pattern, as if indicating the precise location of the stress. It was an impossible coincidence. Eris walked to the large viewport in their lab, looking out at the sprawling, brightly lit colonial hub. Beyond it, the unlit wilderness of Ethelgard stretched into the horizon, a sea of dark, rustling foliage. The hum felt stronger tonight, a pervasive thrum that made the air feel heavy. Eris focused on a particularly large tree, its ancient branches reaching towards the twin moons of Ethelgard. As they watched, a small, intricate piece of Kronos technology, a sensor buoy Valerius's team had deployed just that morning, appeared to detach itself from the tree's bark. It didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to melt, reforming itself into an organic, flower-like growth, still pulsing with the same diagnostic lights, but now integrated seamlessly into the bark. Eris staggered back, their mind racing. This wasn't assimilation. It was mimicry. Perfect, precise, effortless mimicry. The planet wasn't just reacting, it was learning. It was adapting. It was watching. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They had come to conquer a world confident in their technological superiority, their unshakable will. But what if this world wasn't merely a resource to be exploited? What if it was something else entirely, something ancient, something aware, something waiting? As the Kronos hegemony's flag fluttered proudly atop the central command spire, announcing their glorious claim over Ethelgard, Dr. Eris Thorn felt a chilling certainty deep within their core. They had not discovered a new paradise. They had walked into a trap, and the planet was just beginning to smile. The chill that settled in Eris's bones was not born of Ethelgard's temperate climate, but of a cold, stark epiphany. It was the terror of an ant realizing the anthill it so diligently inhabited was, in fact, the nostril of a slumbering god. Every moment of effortless progress, every stroke of perceived good fortune was now cast in a sinister new light. The planet wasn't yielding, it was inviting. It was opening its maw and beckoning them inside. Eris raced through the corridors of the colonial hub, their mind a maelstrom of hypotheses and horrifying conclusions. They had to warn Valerius. He had to see reason. Armed with the visual data from the mimicked sensor buoy, Eris bypassed protocol and stormed onto the bridge of the orbital cruiser via a priority comms channel. Valerius's face materialized on the main screen, his expression a mask of cold irritation at the unscheduled intrusion. "Dr. Thorne, this is highly irregular. Report." Eris, breathless, quickly relayed their discovery, the words tumbling out in a torrent of scientific observation and barely concealed panic. They displayed the image of the sensor buoy, now a grotesque, living parody of Kronos technology seamlessly integrated into the alien tree. "Commander, you don't understand. The planet isn't just a collection of resources. It's a single, complex organism. It's observing us, learning from us, replicating our technology at a biological level. The sensor wasn't corroded or overgrown. It was digested and then remade." Valerius stared at the image for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice dangerously calm. "What you are showing me, Doctor, is an example of an aggressive, previously undocumented native mold or fungus. It has clearly enveloped and degraded the equipment. I commend your diligence in identifying a potential maintenance issue. Now, I suggest you return to your actual duties. Your imaginative theories are counterproductive to morale. The condescension was a physical blow." "Commander, this is not fungus," Eris insisted, their voice rising. "I'm tracking a complex energy signature, a bionetwork that permeates the entire planetary crust. It's intelligent. Ensign Rorik's disappearance. It wasn't a predator. The planet took him." Valerius's eyes narrowed into slits of obsidian. "Dr. Thorne, you are now bordering on insubordination and hysteria. Ensign Rorik was the victim of a tragic but explainable biological encounter. Your unsubstantiated fear-mongering will cease immediately. I am ordering you to take a mandatory rest cycle and submit to a full psychological evaluation. We are the Kronos hegemony. We are not undone by overactive botany. Is that clear?" The communication channel went dead, leaving Eris standing in the sterile silence of their lab, utterly alone. The dismissal was absolute. Valerius wouldn't listen. He couldn't. His entire worldview, the very foundation of the hegemony's doctrine, was predicated on the universe being a dead thing, a collection of matter to be shaped and claimed. To acknowledge Ethelgard as a peer, or worse, a superior, was a heresy he could not even contemplate. Eris knew then that they would get no help from command. They were on their own. The planet, meanwhile, seemed to sense the shift. The hum intensified, no longer a subtle vibration, but a constant, low-frequency pressure that made one's teeth ache and vision swim at the edges. Personnel began to complain of vivid, unsettling dreams of sinking into soft, warm earth, of roots and vines intertwining with their limbs, of a vast, silent consciousness that knew their every thought. One grizzled mining engineer, a veteran of a dozen hostile world extractions named Jax, experienced it firsthand. While calibrating a deep core drill, his high-tensile alloy wrench began to soften in his hand, its rigid form drooping like warm wax. He dropped it with a curse, watching in disbelief as it flowed into a puddle, then reshaped itself into a perfect, six-petaled flower that pulsed with a faint, internal light before dissolving into the soil. When he reported the incident, he was laughed out of the foreman's office and quietly reassigned to surface duty. He didn't mention the whispers he'd heard, a chorus of voices in his head that had seemed to coax the metal into its new form, promising him rest, promising him peace. While the crew grew more unnerved, Valerius found his own convictions bolstered. The very mining operation Jax had been working on struck a miraculous vein of pure, unrefined quantium, a rare and vital element for starship cores. It was a find of unprecedented scale, located just meters below the surface, requiring none of the usual costly and dangerous deep drilling. Reports of this discovery sent a wave of celebration through the Hegemony Command. Valerius was lauded as a visionary, his choice of Ethelgard a stroke of genius. The colony's mission was no longer just a success, it was a legend in the making. The planet was giving them its greatest treasures, a clear sign of its submission to a superior power. To Valerius, it was proof. To Eris, it was bait, driven by a desperate need for proof. Eris worked feverishly in their lab, ignoring Valerius's orders. They focused their research on the soil and water samples taken from the area around the mimicked sensor. Under microscopic analysis, the truth was more terrifying than they had imagined. The soil was not inert matter. It was teeming with a network of microscopic, crystalline organisms. They were not merely alive. They were connected, forming a vast biological quantum computer. Eris watched, mesmerized and horrified, as these crystalline motes communicated via light pulses, rearranging themselves to form complex structures, breaking down a sample of Chronos-grade steel and reassembling it into organic cellular chains with terrifying efficiency. They were nanoscopic architects, a planetary intelligence distributed through every grain of dust, every drop of water. The planet didn't have a brain. The planet was a brain, and this brain was now fully aware of them. The second disappearance was not as quiet as the first. A three-person geological survey team, tasked with mapping the extent of the quantium vein, ventured into a network of newly opened caves a few kilometers from the main hub. Their comms suddenly filled with a burst of static, followed by a single, choked scream, and then silence. When the rapid response team arrived, they found the cave system empty. The survey equipment was still there, its lights blinking methodically in the darkness. But of the three geologists, there was no sign. This time, however, the planet left a message. In the center of the largest cavern, where the geologists had set up their primary scanner, stood three crystalline statues. They were perfect, life-sized replicas of the missing team members, their faces captured in expressions of serene, ecstatic bliss. The detail was flawless, down to the last stitch on their uniforms, the faintest scar on a cheek. They weren't frozen, they were alive. As light pulsed within their crystalline forms, and if one stood close enough, they could feel a faint vibration and hear that same pervasive hum, now seeming to emanate directly from the statues themselves. Valerius could no longer dismiss the events as coincidence. He locked down the colony, declared the caves off-limits, and secretly tripled the armed patrols. Publicly, he maintained that the survey team had been lost in a sudden, unmapped cave-in, a tragic but unavoidable risk of their profession. But the fear was now palpable. The easy compliance of Ethelgard had vanished, replaced by a creeping, suffocating sense of being watched by an unseen, all-powerful entity. The whispers became more frequent, no longer just a faint murmur on the wind, but clear, distinct words that wormed their way into the minds of the colonists. They promised release from toil, an end to pain, a glorious union with the world. Some colonists began to show signs of psychological breakdown, staring for hours at the rustling foliage, humming tunelessly to themselves. A few simply walked out of the compound gates at night and were never seen again. Eris knew their time was running out. The planet was no longer just observing, it was actively recruiting. It was dismantling the hegemony's presence, not with force, but with seduction and quiet absorption. Armed with the data on the crystalline neural network and the horrifying images of the living statues, Eris made a decision. They could not convince Valerius, so they would bypass him. They would warn the colonists directly, whatever the cost. Working with a desperate speed, Eris hacked into the colony's central communication system, patching their personal data pad into the emergency broadcast network. They took a deep breath. The hum of the planet, a monstrous counterpoint to the frantic beating of their own heart, and initiated the broadcast. Their face appeared on every screen in New Kronos, from the main command center to the personal displays in the barracks. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne." They began, their voice shaking but firm. "I am overriding command authority to deliver an urgent warning. We are not alone on this planet. We are not its masters. Ethelgard is a sentient entity, a planetary-scale intelligence. It is not our prize. We are its specimens. It is learning from us, and it is taking us. The disappearances, the strange phenomena, it is the planet, communicating in the only way it knows how. We must evacuate. I repeat, we must evacuate now, before we are all—" The broadcast cut out, replaced by a blaring alarm. Red lights flashed through Eris's lab. Through the comms, a single, ice-cold voice sliced through the chaos, devoid of any emotion but absolute authority. It was Valerius. "Dr. Thorne, you are relieved of your duties. Security teams are en route to your location. You have just committed treason." Eris looked out the viewport, past their own reflection, at the emerald wilderness beyond the compound walls. In the distance, the bioluminescent flora of Ethelgard began to pulse, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and intensity, their lights blinking in a complex, rhythmic pattern, a silent, planetary applause. The security team, clad in the stark black armor of the hegemony's elite enforcers, moved with brutal efficiency. They stormed Eris's lab, Roet's weapons raised, their movements precise and devoid of hesitation. There was no negotiation, no questioning. Eris was seized, their research terminal and personal data pad confiscated, and they were unceremoniously hauled away. The charges were swift and severe sedition, inciting panic, and gross insubordination. Treason. Valerius, it seemed, was determined to excise this intellectual cancer before it could metastasize. Eris was confined to a sterile, white-walled holding cell deep within the command spire. It was a place designed for maximum sensory deprivation, a quiet, humming box meant to break the spirit before the official interrogation even began. But for Eris, the silence was a lie. The planet's voice, the pervasive, low-frequency hum, was clearer here than ever before. It resonated through the very foundations of the spire, a constant companion in their isolation. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the marrow of their bones, a pressure against the inside of their skull. And now, for the first time, the whispers coalesced into something coherent, a stream of thought that was not their own. You tried to warn them. They do not listen. Their minds are rigid, brittle, like the metal they shape. The voice was not a single entity, but a chorus. 1,000 threads of consciousness woven into one. It was ancient, patient, and utterly alien. There was no malice in its tone, only a profound, almost detached curiosity. They feel pain, fear, separation. Such strange concepts. We do not understand them. We only wish to learn, to add your pattern to our own. Eris pressed their hands to their temples, trying to block out the intrusion, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. The planet was inside their head. It sifted through their memories, not with force, but with the gentle, inexorable pressure of water seeping into stone. It examined their understanding of physics, their knowledge of Chronos biology, their feelings of fear and frustration. It was a mind-bogglingly intimate violation, performed with the impersonal air of a scientist dissecting a specimen. Meanwhile, on the surface, Valerius's attempts to reassert control were failing spectacularly. The living statues of the geological team, which he had ordered encased in high-density plasma shielding, had simply vanished from their confinement, leaving behind only the shimmering, deactivated energy fields. They didn't break out, they dematerialized, their crystalline forms dissolving into the air and presumably rejoining the planetary consciousness. Their disappearance sent a fresh wave of terror through the colony. The very laws of physics, as the Chronos hegemony understood them, were coming undone. Technology, the bedrock of their dominance, was proving to be a fragile shield against an enemy that did not recognize its rules. The whispers grew bolder. No longer were they confined to the minds of the isolated or the psychologically stressed. Now, everyone heard them. They were a constant, subliminal chorus during mess hall meals, a faint, lulling murmur over the comms during patrol duty. The messages were always the same. Cease your struggle. Become part of the whole. There is no pain here. There is only harmony. Union. Let go. The mining operation, once the colony's greatest triumph, ground to a halt. The quantium vein, which had once seemed so pure and accessible, began to behave erratically. Drills would hit pockets of inexplicable temporal distortion, their chronometers spinning wildly as the drill bits aged to dust in seconds. Tunnel walls would phase in and out of existence, revealing glimpses of other places. Other times, a wind-swept alien desert under a binary sun, a sprawling crystalline city humming with light. The terrified face of Ensign Rorik, mouth open in a silent scream, before the rock solidified again. Valerius, his face a grim mask of denial, ordered the mines sealed. He declared the quantium too unstable to extract, a geological anomaly. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. His iron-fisted authority was being eroded not by rebellion, but by a creeping, insidious madness that seemed to emanate from the very soil. His breaking point came when he received a priority message from the Eternal Vigilance. His flagship still in orbit. Chief Navigator Kalen's face appeared on his private screen, pale and shaken. "Commander, you need to see this." The view switched to the ship's primary astrogation chart. Ethelgard, the emerald and blue sphere, was no longer alone. Surrounding it, in perfect, silent formation, were a dozen exact replicas of the Eternal Vigilance. They were not ghosts or sensor echoes. They registered as solid objects, identical down to the last hull plate, the last transponder signature. They just hung there in the void, a silent, impossible fleet mirroring their own. They appeared out of nowhere. "Sir?" Kalen stammered. No warp signature. No energy displacement. They just are. We've hailed them. No response. They are mimicking our ship. Commander. Perfectly. Valerius stared at the screen, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his command console. This was no longer a planetary anomaly. This was a strategic threat of unimaginable scale. An entity that could replicate his most powerful warship at will was not a primitive life form. It was a god-tier power. The arrogance of the Kronos hegemony, the belief in their own supremacy, shattered in that moment, leaving behind only the cold, sharp shards of terror. He had to get his people out. He had to warn the hegemony. This wasn't a world to be colonized. It was a quarantine zone to be established, a celestial horror to be contained at all costs. He issued a single desperate command: begin full, immediate evacuation of all surface personnel. The order sparked chaos. Sirens blared across New Kronos. The colonists, already teetering on the edge of a collective breakdown, scrambled for the designated transport hubs. The carefully constructed order of the hegemony dissolved into a frantic rush for survival, but the planet was not going to let them go. As the first transport ship, the ironclad, began its ascent, the ground beneath it began to liquefy. The reinforced landing pad, a marvel of Kronos engineering, softened and warped, its metal plates flowing like mud, massive, vine-like tendrils, woven from soil and root and crystalline structures, erupted from the earth, thick as the ship's own support columns. They wrapped around the ironclad's landing gear, its engine nacelles, its hull, pulling the struggling vessel back down to the surface with an irresistible, silent strength. The ship groaned, its superstructure straining against the impossible force. From the command spire, Valerius watched in horror as the planet consumed his transport. The vines tightened, their crystalline components glowing with an eerie light. The ship's hull began to buckle, not breaking, but flowing, its metallic structure being unwoven and repatterned at a molecular level. It was being absorbed, assimilated, just like the sensor buoy, just like the missing colonists. In his cell, Eris felt the planet's consciousness surge with a new intensity. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of confusion. Why do you leave? Why do you pull away? We offer you unity. We offer you eternity. Why do you choose the cold, empty void over the warmth of the whole through the planet's senses? Eris experienced the attack on the ironclad. They felt the ship's desperate struggle, the fear of the crew within, the straining of the metal. But from the planet's perspective, it was a gesture of embrace, an attempt to hold on to a fascinating new piece of itself that was trying to break away. It did not understand separation. It could not comprehend the concept of individuality. The destruction of the ship was an accidental consequence of its loving, possessive grasp. It was in that moment that Eris understood the true horror of their situation. They were not facing an enemy you could fight, an enemy you could reason with, or at least understand its motives. They were facing a mind so vast and so fundamentally different from their own that communication was impossible. It was like a human trying to explain philosophy to a cell in their own body. The very concepts of life, death, self, and other did not exist for Ethelgard. It only knew one state being, and it wanted them to be with it. Forever. The destruction of the ironclad broke the last vestiges of morale. Panic turned to despair. The colonists knew they were trapped. As Valerius stared at the mangled, half-absorbed wreckage of his transport ship, a new transmission came through on his command frequency. It was not from his fleet. It was not from his crew. The screen flickered, and the face that appeared was that of Ensign Rorik. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared, but his eyes were different. They were calm, ancient, and filled with a light that was not his own. Behind him was not the dark of the forest, but an infinite, swirling nexus of light and energy. "Commander," Rorik's voice said, though the tone was layered with 1,000 others, "you must stop fighting. It is so much easier to let go. We are all waiting for you. Come and see. Come and be one with us." Valerius, his face pale and sweat-sheened, drew his sidearm, a sleek, powerful plasma pistol. He looked at the screen, at the face of his lost officer, now a puppet for a planetary god. Then he looked out his viewport at the world he had come to conquer, a world that was now actively, lovingly devouring them. He raised the pistol, but he didn't point it at the screen. He pointed it at the master control for the holding cells. With a single, decisive shot, he blew the lock mechanism. An automated voice announced, "Containment breach. Cell block Delta." A moment later, Eris's cell door slid open. Valerius's voice came over the internal comm, ragged and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Thorn, you were right. Forgive me. Now, get us off this god's-forsaken rock." The door to the holding cell slid open with a soft hiss, revealing not the armored enforcers Eris had expected, but the cavernous, echoing silence of an empty corridor. Valerius's voice, stripped of its commanding timbre and frayed with desperation, was a ghost in the internal comm system. It was a surrender, a plea, and a horrifying vindication all at once. Eris stepped out of the cell, their mind still reeling from the intimate mental contact with the planetary consciousness. They weren't just a prisoner anymore. They were a prophet whose apocalypse had arrived right on schedule. They found Valerius on the command bridge, standing amidst the controlled chaos. Alarms flashed on secondary screens, but the main viewport was filled with the serene, beautiful, and utterly malevolent image of Ethelgard. The commander looked 10 cycles older than he had that morning. The crisp lines of his uniform seemed to hang on a diminished frame, and the unshakable certainty in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out stare. "It's not a planet, Thorn," he said without turning, his voice a low rasp. "It's a grave, and it's still digging." He gestured to a side monitor displaying the half-absorbed wreckage of the ironclad, which was now pulsing with a soft, green bioluminescence, already becoming one with the landscape. "And space is a cage," he added, pointing to the main screen where the dozen perfect replicas of the Eternal Vigilance maintained their silent, mocking vigil. "We can't go down. We can't go up. It's been toying with us this whole time, letting us build our little sandcastle before the tide comes in. It's not toying with us, Commander," Aris corrected, their own voice steadier than they felt. "It doesn't understand malice. It's trying to keep us. It sees our departure as a form of self-harm, like a limb trying to tear itself from a body. It's holding on." Valerius finally turned, his gaze locking onto Eris. It was the look of a drowning man spotting a piece of driftwood. "Then tell me how to make it let go. You understand it. You talk to it." The bridge crew, those who hadn't already succumbed to panic or the siren call of the whispers, stared at Eris with a mixture of awe and terror. The mad scientist was now their only hope. Eris's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of understanding gleaned from their mental contact. "We can't fight it on a physical level. It controls the physical. Matter is its native language. Our weapons, our ships, they're just new words for it to learn. And we can't outsmart it on a cognitive level. Its mind is the size of a world. Then we're dead." A nearby officer muttered, slumping into his chair. "No," Aris said, a desperate, incandescent idea beginning to form. Its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. Its consciousness is everywhere, distributed through every particle of this planet. It is fundamentally, intrinsically part of this reality. It can't conceive of anything else, so we have to do something it can't understand. We don't leave through space. We leave through reality itself. Valerius stared, uncomprehending. "What in the void are you talking about?" "The Spire's primary power core," Eris explained, pointing down at the floor. "It's a contained singularity, a miniature warp drive engine designed to power this entire colony for a century. It functions by creating a stable, controlled distortion in space-time. We are going to make it unstable. We are going to overload the core, not to create an explosion, but a schism, a temporary, violent tear in the fabric of reality. We won't be flying away. We'll be punching a hole into somewhere else, and taking this section of the Spire with us." The plan was insane. It was a shot in the absolute dark, a Hail Mary based on a theoretical physicist's wildest fantasy. There was no telling where they would end up, or in how many pieces, but it was a chance. It was the one thing the planet, for all its power, might not be able to predict or prevent. It couldn't grasp a concept that existed outside of its own physical universe. Valerius absorbed the desperate logic of the plan. A flicker of his old self, the decisive commander, returned to his eyes. He saw a path, however narrow and treacherous, out of the grave. "How many can we take?" "Only the command Spire itself," Eris said grimly. "The core's effect will be localized. We can maybe save a few hundred people, whoever can make it to this structure in time. Then do it," Valerius commanded, turning to his remaining officers. "Send out a general broadcast. All remaining personnel, fall back to the command Spire immediately. This is not a request. It is our last stand and our only escape." He then turned to his chief of security. "Take every soldier you have left. Form a perimeter. We need to buy Dr. Thorne time to get to the reactor chamber and begin the overload sequence. Hold the line until you are relieved or you are dead." The journey to the reactor chamber, located in the deepest sublevel of the Spire, was a descent into a waking nightmare. The planet was no longer being subtle. It knew what they were planning, or at least, it sensed their unified intent to flee, and it was escalating its efforts to keep them. The sterile, metallic corridors of the Spire were actively changing. Patches of wall softened into a pulsating, fleshy substance. Crystalline growths, like cancerous geodes, erupted from the floor, blocking passageways. The air grew thick and sweet with the scent of alien blossoms, a cloying perfume that carried the whispers, now a constant, pleading cacophony in their minds. "Don't go. Stay. Be with us. Be eternal. Be complete." They passed colonists who had simply given up. A woman sat against a wall, a blissful smile on her face as glowing moss grew up her legs, anchoring her to the floor. A group of engineers stood transfixed, staring at a section of the ceiling that had dissolved into a swirling vortex of stars. Their tools dropped at their feet. They were lost. Valerius, his plasma pistol in hand, didn't even look at them. He was a shepherd trying to save the last of his flock. He could not mourn the ones already claimed by the wolf. The planet's manifestations grew more aggressive. The chitinous, vine-like tendrils they'd seen attack the ironclad began bursting through walls and ceilings, whipping through the corridors like monstrous tentacles. Valerius and his security team laid down a withering barrage of plasma fire, searing the appendages, which would retreat with a silent, psychic shriek, only to erupt from another direction moments later. They lost soldiers. One was dragged screaming into a wall that turned to viscous fluid behind him. Another simply stopped, dropped his weapon, and walked calmly into an alcove that sealed shut like a sphincter. Eris, protected by the desperate phalanx of soldiers, felt the planet's immense, confused sorrow. Why do you hurt us? We are you. We are one. This pain is ours. It didn't understand combat. It only understood that a part of itself was fighting back, causing a sensation that was profoundly, horribly wrong. Finally, bleeding, exhausted, and with their numbers halved, they reached the massive blast doors of the reactor chamber. They were sealed, but the metal of the doors was groaning and warping, denting inward as if under immense pressure. Strange, crystalline veins were spreading across its surface, pulsing with a faint, internal light. The planet was trying to crack open the spire's heart. "Get it open!" Now Valerius roared at the surviving engineer. As the engineer frantically worked to override the locks, Eris placed a hand on the vibrating door. The whispers were deafening here, a psychic storm that threatened to tear their sanity apart. They saw visions, their childhood home on Kronos, their first scientific breakthrough, the face of their long-dead mentor, all offering them peace, release, a chance to stop fighting. It was a targeted assault, using their own memories as weapons. They gritted their teeth, focusing on the cold, hard physics of the singularity core. It was the only thing keeping them anchored to their own mind. With a final shriek of tortured metal, the blast doors shuddered open just enough for them to squeeze through. They sealed them shut behind them, plunging the chamber into the crimson glow of emergency lighting. The reactor chamber was vast, a cathedral of technology built around the central containment sphere, which hummed with terrifying, controlled power. But they were not alone. The planet was already here. Crystalline vines, thick as an arm, snaked across the floor and up the walls, converging on the reactor's control console. They seemed to be probing it, tasting its energy, learning its function. In the center of the room, standing before the console as if to welcome them, was a figure. It was the mining engineer, Jax. His body was unchanged, but his eyes were black, empty voids, and a serene, knowing smile graced his lips. "You are too late," the chorus of voices said, speaking through Jax's mouth. "We have already learned so much. This heart, it is a beautiful new song. We will add it to our own, and you with it. It is time to come home." The vines around the chamber began to glow brighter, the hum rising to an unbearable crescendo. Ethelgard was about to seize control of their last hope and turn their ark into another beautiful feature in its planetary museum. The sight of Jax, a once gruff and grounded man now serving as the serene mouthpiece for a planetary intelligence, was a visceral shock. His presence wasn't a threat of violence, but of absolute, inevitable consumption. The glowing vines pulsed in time with his words, their crystalline structures resonating with the thrum of the singularity core. The planet wasn't just trying to break in, it was harmonizing with the spire's heart, learning its song so it could make it its own. Valerius raised his pistol, the weapons targeting laser painting a red dot on Jax's forehead. "Get away from the console." The thing wearing Jax's face simply smiled, a gesture of infinite, placid patience. "You still think in terms of places, of here and there. We are already in the console. We are in the wall. We are in the air you breathe. We are in you. You have carried our seeds within you since you first set foot on our soil. As if to punctuate the statement, one of Valerius's own soldiers gasped, his eyes widening. He looked down at his arm, where faint, glowing lines, like a bioluminescent circuit board, were spreading beneath his skin. He hadn't been attacked. He had been infected, colonized from the inside out. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a soft, melodic hum emerged. Panic threatened to shatter their fragile resolve. This was the endgame. The planet wasn't just an external force, it was a contagion. They were all ticking clocks. Now Valerius roared, finally abandoning reason for pure, desperate action. He and the few remaining loyal soldiers opened fire, not just on Jax, but on the encroaching vines, blasting them into incandescent ruin. They knew it was futile, that the tendrils would regrow in seconds, but they were buying seconds, and seconds were all they had left. The being that was Jax didn't even flinch as plasma bolts tore through his borrowed body. He simply raised a hand, and the vines surged forward, moving with a liquid but terrifying speed. Arid, meanwhile, ignored the firefight. They scrambled towards the master control console, their mind a laser focus of scientific purpose. The planet's psychic whispers were a hurricane in their thoughts, showing them images of ultimate peace, of becoming one with a cosmic symphony, a temptation of godhood itself. They fought it back with equations, with the cold, hard logic of physics, using the structure of science as a shield against the seduction of dissolution. The console was a complex interface of holographic keys and crystalline data ports. The planet's influence was already visible, with alien, organic-looking algorithms scrolling across the diagnostic screens. Eris shoved their hand into the main coolant regulation port, bypassing the standard interface and forcing a direct neural link. The pain was excruciating, like ice and fire flooding their nervous system, but it gave them what they needed: direct, instantaneous access to the reactor's deepest functions. Their consciousness plunged into a sea of pure energy and mathematical constructs. They could feel the planet's mind there as well, a vast, inquisitive presence, examining the singularity, marveling at its elegant simplicity. Such a perfect little storm, a beautiful, lonely point of impossible existence. You would break it. You would shatter this wonderful song. Eris ignored the plea. They began inputting the overload sequence, not by typing, but by sheer force of will, rewriting the core's containment protocols. They pushed past the failsafes, rerouted the energy regulators, and began to dismantle the delicate balance that kept the singularity from devouring everything around it. The chamber began to shake violently. The humming of the core deepened, becoming a visceral, gut-wrenching groan. The crimson emergency lights flickered and died, plunging them into a darkness illuminated only by the pulsing reactor sphere and the flashes of plasma fire. The entity controlling Jax seemed to feel the shift. Its placid expression faltered, replaced by something akin to confusion, then alarm. No, you are hurting the pattern. You are creating silence, an empty space. This is wrong. Stop. The vines recoiled from the console as if burned. The very concept of non-existence, of a true void, was anathema to it. It was a dissonant chord in its perfect universal harmony. Valerius saw his chance. With the entity momentarily distracted, he charged forward, tackling the thing that was Jax, driving his combat knife deep into its chest. The act was pointless physically, but it was a symbolic defiance, a final act of individual will against the collective. The body of Jax fell, and for a moment, the psychic pressure lessened. The overload sequence was reaching its tipping point. A halo of pure, white light began to form around the reactor sphere, and the very air in the chamber began to warp. Objects at the edge of the room seemed to stretch and distort. Amos itself was becoming elastic. Eris pulled their hand back from the console, their arms scorched and smoking from the raw data feed. "It's done," they screamed over the rising roar of the collapsing singularity. "It's going to the world dissolved." There was no explosion. There was no sound. There was only a silent, instantaneous lurch, a feeling of being turned inside out and stretched across infinity. Colors that had no names flooded their vision. The laws of physics became a meaningless suggestion. They were not in a place. They were in the transition between places. Ares felt the command spire, their tiny island of reality, being squeezed through a crack in the universe. They felt Ethelgard's consciousness recoil, a vast, psychic shriek of pain and utter bafflement as a piece of itself was not just destroyed, but erased from its perception. The planet could not follow. This new state of being was a mathematical impossibility to its nature. It was like trying to describe the color blue to a creature that exists only in 2 dimensions. They had escaped by becoming incomprehensible. Then, with an equally jarring lurch, reality reasserted itself. The command spire stood in silence, its emergency lights flickering back on. The shaking had stopped. The whispers were gone. The silence was the most profound, beautiful sound Eris had ever heard. Valerius picked himself up from the floor, his face bruised, his uniform torn. He looked at Eris, then at the handful of dazed, surviving soldiers. They were alive. They were free. He stumbled to the main viewport, wiping away the condensation with the back of his hand, and stared out into the impossible. They were not in orbit around a star. They were not in the familiar, ink-black void of space. They were adrift in a swirling, violet nebula, a place that did not exist on any Chronos hegemony star chart. Strange, crystalline structures, the size of moons, drifted past in the distance. The laws of physics here felt softer, more malleable. They had not just jumped across space, they had jumped into an entirely different dimension or a secluded, uncharted pocket of their own. Eris joined him at the viewport, their body aching, their mind scarred but whole. "Where are we?" Valerius asked, his voice filled with a weary awe. "I don't know," Ares admitted. "Somewhere new, somewhere it can't find us." Their gambit had worked. They had saved a remnant, a few hundred souls from the ravenous, loving embrace of Ethelgard. But the cost was immense. They were cut off, adrift, the last survivors of a failed colony, lost in an unknown cosmos. They had lost their empire, their technology, their certainty. They had paid for their survival with their entire universe. Valerius looked at the faces of his remaining crew, no longer a proud commander of an unstoppable armada, but the reluctant leader of a tribe of refugees. The arrogance of the Chronos hegemony was a distant memory, a folly of a species that had thought itself the masters of creation. They had learned a terrible lesson that the universe was not a dead thing to be conquered, but was filled with wonders and horrors far beyond their comprehension. And sometimes the most terrifying monster is the one that only wants to love you to pieces. As the spire drifted silently through the violet haze, Valerius issued his first and last command as a castaway. "Mark this on the historical logs. What's left of them," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Log entry 1 of a new calendar. We are the lost, but we are alive. And we will remember Ethelgard, not as a prize we lost, but as a lesson we survived."